Is it finally time for Congress to consider a flat tax? Would the same rate across the board enable all of us to pay what President Obama calls our fair share? My next guest just met with fellow members of Congress, top economists, business leaders, all pushing for a flat tax as the only way to reform the tax code. Joining me now, Utah Senator Mike Lee. Senator, first of all, I'm really glad to hear that you had this meeting. How did it go? Who was there? What came out of it?
Well, the meeting was led by Congressman Louis Gohmert and by Steve Forbes, and it was basically just a discussion about the fact that we ought to move in the direction of a single-rate tax system, one that provides more transparency to the American people about the true cost of government. We sometimes forget the fact that our tax system serves two functions. One is to provide revenue for the government, but the other is to make sure that voters understand what government costs. And our current tax code performs the first function relatively poorly, producing a lot of revenue some years and not very much in others. And it performs the second function even worse than that, because it obscures the true cost of government to a lot of people who, while they might be convinced that they're paying nothing or very little in taxes, actually pay a lot for government. They just pay for it through high prices on goods and services and diminished wages and unemployment.
Well, listen, with all due respect to you, and I'm glad you're doing this, but what's the pushback or the feedback you're getting from fellow members? I've always thought the reason why Congress doesn't do a flat tax is it takes a lot of the power of the purse and the Internal Revenue Code away from you and your fellow members.
Which is exactly why we ought to do it. And you're right. I think that's a lot of the reason why this has been an issue that hasn't moved forward farther than it has to this point. But the American people are starting to understand all the benefits that could come from this. And I think it's an idea whose time has come. It's an idea that we need to usher in, especially as we're dealing with the fiscal cliff problems that we're dealing with right now.
Are you getting any support, or do people look at you cross-eyed when you talk to them? I'm talking about fellow senators.
Yeah. There are a lot of Republicans in both houses of Congress who feel that this is something that we need to do. There's still a lot of doubt out there. A lot of people just respond to it by saying, yeah, great idea, but it'll never pass. But when we get to a moment like this one, where we have a president trying to pit one group of Americans against another by threatening only a small segment with a tax increase, this underscores the need for a flat tax system. And this gives us an opportunity to explain that even a tax increase on the rich ends up hurting the poor. That's why we oppose it. It's not because we're concerned about the rich. It's because we're concerned about the people who work for the rich who will lose their jobs.
All right, but listen, I've said before what you just said about the fact, this thing will never pass, and I get criticized for, not being more positive about this. It probably won't pass in today's environment, but is this a strategy that you have to try and get the conversation, get the noise going on this so that maybe people do it 4 years down the road?
Yes. Look, Rome wasn't built in a day, and we're not going to transition into a single-rate tax system overnight. But I do think it is a good long-term objective. I think it's something that we need to have. And the truth is, if you ask most Americans what they think about how much government ought to be able to take from them, most Americans, if asked the right questions, will eventually say, yeah, everybody ought to just pay based on the same percentage.
All right, the big question then is, what was the rate that you talked about? Was there a consensus of 10%, 20%? What was it?
There's not a consensus rate because there are 1,000 different formulations for this. I've heard rates discussed as low as 12%, other rates discussed as high as low to mid-30s for a flat tax proposal. It all depends on whether or to what extent you still recognize any deductions or grant any credits, and that will influence what the rate needs to be. But we need to start building consensus around the common idea that we need one rate that all Americans can understand, instead of a tax code that occupies tens of thousands of pages.
You're right. It sounds simple, but it's actually complex when you figure out all the different ways that people make money and so forth. Senator Mike Lee, I encourage you and glad to see you're doing this. Thank you so much. Thanks for being on the program.
Thank you.